So doors are closing. So I guess this means it's time for me to start talking. This is a pretty good amount of people in here. Thank all of you for coming. I realize there are like a lot of good choices, like the Django talk that you could have gone to. So it means a lot that you guys are here. All right, so I'm going to talk about building mobile apps with AngularJS and PhoneGap. But first, a little bit about me. My name's Brian. There's like my contacts. I will work on AngularJS at Google. So my story is, last summer I was there as an intern, and for the past couple of months while I was finishing my degree, I worked part-time on AngularJS, and actually the week after I get back to the States, I'm flying out to California to start full-time on AngularJS. I'm also co-authoring a book, AngularJS in Action. So if you like books and you like my talk, that might be something for you to look into. And I really like open source. I'm excited to be able to work full-time on it, and I think it's going to be a lot of fun. So thanks for having me, and again, thanks for coming. So this talk, it's going to be 50% intro to Angular. Then I'm going to talk a little bit about PhoneGap and Angular. There was a talk earlier about PhoneGap, and presumably those of you who are just interested in PhoneGap and not the Angular went to that one. How many attended that talk? Just hands, maybe? All right, so a couple of you guys. All right, cool. So just a little light on that and a few things relating to that in Angular. Then 34% kind of a case study. So I wrote more of a proof of concept, moderate level complexity app, just to prove that you could do all of this and try and find the challenges and, see if this is an awesome way to make mobile apps. And then 1% unicorns. I don't know if you guys can see in the back, but my slides have unicorns in the back. So there's a lot more to Angular and PhoneGap that I can possibly cover in 45 minutes. Please, you guys just shout stuff out if you're interested. If you're like, how'd you do that? Why is this like this? Just let me know, because this is for you guys. All right, so story time. You're writing an app, and you decide to write a web app, because presumably you're a web developer. How many in here are web developers? Everyone? Yep, everyone's a web developer. All right, awesome. So naturally, it should work on mobile. It's not even really an option anymore to not consider mobile. So naturally, even though you've kind of defined these sort of core principles, you still have a lot of choices to make. So one of them might be, do I want to use AngularJS? So WTF is an AngularJS. So it's a JavaScript framework. And how many of you guys have heard of it? Again, just, OK. How about used it? Anyone use it? You guys use it in production stuff, or you just mess around with it on the weekend? Production, really? Awesome, good stuff. Okay, so why would you want to use AngularJS? So I personally think that it's just a great way to write web apps. Angular is really extensive. It really simplifies writing these rich, complex web apps. And I also think that this is a big plus recently, is there's just a great community around it. There's just people churning out new stuff, new components, new this and that for Angular, new write-ups on stuff every week. Just blows me away, the just open source community around it. So the big things in Angular are, for me, the two-way data binding, which, again, you guys know data binding? You can just be like, yeah, okay, sure. It has an opinionated architecture, meaning, you see some libraries like underscore and jQuery and even Backbone. It doesn't really have a whole lot of opinions. It gives you a lot of good functionality, but how you put it together isn't really, there's not a lot of strong opinions on that. It's kind of up to you to architect your own system, which that can be a good thing, but having one architecture that was kind of thought of and planned in advance is also a strength of Angular's, and I think a good way to do things. So then the last feature that I think is really sweet is Angular has its own sort of notion of reusable components called Directives. And again, the open source community around that has been really good. There's just guys churning out all sorts of new widgets and stuff every week. So first, let's talk about two-way data binding. So there's kind of this crazy diagram here. I'm going to start with the others because I assume you guys you're all web developers, so you know how this works. Basically, the way that most frameworks handle it is you have some model and some templating string, and there's some function that takes the model and grabs stuff out of it and does stuff, and eventually it spits out HTML as a string, and then you take that string and you inner HTML some DOM node, and then inside of it you have DOM that's created. And it has to do this every time. And one of the big disadvantages is this phase right here. This is like really slow. And it's slow, and on mobile especially, this can be a really demanding thing. So the way that Angular does it is it has this HTML string, which inside of it has these directives that sort of describe how data binding works, and then Angular takes care of keeping the model and the DOM in sync. And it does this in a really clever way, and I'll show you that in just a second. And then there's like some stuff here that we don't have to worry about quite yet. So like let's actually see what this looks like if we were to write some simple stuff. So, all right. So this is like, typical blank HTML page. We've got just this Angular.js script up here. And so I'm just going to show you like, simplest Angular app that you could do. Right? So we have a div, and inside of it, where we do like 1 plus 1. So in Angular, you can use these double curlies to set up data binding. So this is really boring because this is always going to be 2. Right? Let's see what my network's like. Oh, all right. Sorry, I'm a little ahead of myself. So in order to say that you want AngularJS to like start doing stuff on this, you have to use this special attribute ng-app. There we go. Okay, 2. Woo, that's super amazing, right? Like, you can do this in HTML without any JavaScript, just doing this. Like, why are you wasting my time, man? So the way that this actually gets interesting is when you set up something in here, the bind that's dynamic. So you have some input, and you say, here, let's space this out a little bit. Can you guys read this all right? Maybe this should be a little bigger. Is that better? That's better? All right, cool. Just let me know if you guys can't see, because I'm kind of blind myself. So you can say ng model equals, and then you give it a model. So let's do name. And then underneath we can have a paragraph, and we can say hello name, these double curlies. Hello DMC 13. Cool, right? So think about how you do this in something like jQuery, right? You'd have to first search for some DOM node, then set up a listener for when it gets some on-change event, and then you'd have to go parse the DOM, find where you wanted to put it, and then so on and so forth. And in Angular, this is almost like no code at all that you have to write. So the skeptics among you might be thinking like, all right, this is great, but I don't want to write my whole app in HTML. Like, that's a silly thing to do. So the important thing to note here is that you're only really describing the bindings here. You can't put functions into this double curly thing. You can't write a whole application like this. You have to use controllers in order to add more functionality to it. So let's write like a to-do list app. Right? So you start with this Angular object, and we have to define a module, and we'll call it like to-do app. Right? And then modules take an array of modules that they depend on. We're just going to do this in one module, so we don't have to worry about that. We define a controller, and let's just call this to-do control. And controllers are actually, they're just functions, right? Taco control, that's weird. You guys are supposed to be catching this, come on. All right. So inside of the controller, we have what's called a scope. And the way that you data bind from a controller into here is, first we have to give ng-app the name of our module. So to-do app is the name of our module. And then we also have to say that we want the to-do control to be in charge of this. So we do that. Okay, so now what we could do is we can define a name in here. Or sorry, scope.name. DMC 13. Right? And so now that variable that we put on that scope is in there. Okay, but that's not all, because we can interact with this. Whenever we change the model here in this input, it's actually getting changed inside of the controller. So let's see how we can use something like this to do a to-do list. Right? So we need presumably an array of things. So let's just do list equals empty array for now. Actually, let's put some stuff in there. So let's put some objects in here. Let's have the item have like a name. Give talk on Angular. Right? And then we can data bind to an array using ng repeat and item in list. And this shouldn't be an input. This should be something like, let's do a list item and put this inside of an unordered list. All right. And inside of here, we just want to do like item.name. So that's all that you have to do in order to repeat over something. So there we go. Give talk on Angular. That's pretty cool. And actually, we can do one better than that. We can go ahead and make this into an input box, so that way we could actually change it. Let's just stick to this for now. So let's say we want to add items to this list, right? Let's do an ng model here, and we'll call it new item name. I don't know. I'm not good at naming things on the fly. So let's make this a little bit pretty. And then in order to add it to the list, all we have to do is give some sort of button or something. So we can do like input type equals, let's just do a button element. And we can use ng-click, which perhaps you can guess what this does. This binds one way, so when this element is clicked, it'll fire whatever function you give it. So add item. All right, so then all we have to do is define add item. And this can be a function that pushes onto scope.list a new item that has name equal to scope.newItem. New item name, rather. And sorry, this should be scope.addItem. All right. There you go. See? So that's pretty cool. Without really having to write a whole lot of like crazy code to manipulate the DOM, you have this system that automatically knows what to do with these different models. So let's see here. Just for completion, we'd probably want to, after you add something, you want to do like, clear this name. Right. So now it clears this. Maybe we would want to delete it, so we can do scope.remove item, and that's a function that takes an item, and we have to do like this goofy slice thing. You guys know what I mean, right? Splice, starting at scope.list.index of whatever our item is, and we go space. All right, so if this takes an item in, it'll remove it from the list. And so then all we have to do is bind to that over here. So maybe inside of here we'll have a little hyperlink, basically. And we'll do ng-click again. And here we'll bind remove item, passing in the item here. And since this is all scoped based on this ng repeat, that's how it'll know which item to remove. So let's just put like an X or something inside of here. See? So there we go. We wrote like a really simple to-do list app. And basically all we were doing is writing these methods here to manipulate regular old JavaScript objects. So this is kind of crazy if you've used something like Backbone or Ember or Knockout. Typically, you have to extend like some special model in order to be able to react to these changes. So Angular has like this really super smart way of doing it where essentially it intelligently knows when to check based on these bindings, and it'll go through, diff your model, and then if there is some change, then it only re-renders the part of the DOM that matters. So doing this means that it's pretty fast, and also it's a good developer experience. Right? So that's kind of what we saw here, right? This continuous update loop. So I was able to just modify that array using just regular old JavaScript APIs, and Angular kept it all in sync. Right? So we saw a little bit of this in my example as well, but there's this architecture where you have a controller which exposes things on the scope, and you only, again, the things on the scope are just regular old JavaScript objects. You can add methods on there, functions, and then inside of your HTML, you set up bindings to these things that you have on the scope. Right? So the other cool thing about Angular is you can write your own like crazy directives, as they're called, to add new features to HTML, essentially. So the things that we saw, like ng-controller and ng-click, these are actually directives, and Angular has a system that basically walks through the DOM tree and sets up the listeners and does things depending on these sort of components. So I'll show you a couple like written by cool open source guys later, but for now, just think, what if I could hack HTML to do whatever I wanted? All right, so again, community. This is like really, really amazing, I think, that we have so many people interested in Angular. So let me open up a tab here, and assuming Bower is working. Do you guys know what Bower is? It's like a relatively new kind of front-end package manager thing from the guys at Twitter. But we can search for Angular on here, and depending on if... There we go. So like, there's just a ton of stuff people have written for Angular on Bower. And like, quality's pretty good, too. I mean, it's not like there's just guys throwing a bunch of crap up on there. But besides that, there's a lot of great resources if you're interested in Angular. I'm not going to spend too much more time on it in my talk, but there's egghead.io by this awesome guy, John Lindquist. If you guys use like WebStorm or PHP Storm, he's from JetBrains, the company behind that. So he's done all these like little YouTube videos that just like really quick explain some concept. There's another blog, Year of Moo. Like this guy, like he just has some great write-ups on here. So check out this. This is One Hungry Mind by my good friend Lucas Rubelkey. So he has different things like you can actually build Windows 8 apps with Angular. And then my humble blog as well. Mine's basically like Angular plus new technology of the week. The mailing list is good, and we're obviously on GitHub. So you can be like, hey, this crap's broken, and we'll get back to you and stuff. So not just having all these things, but actually there's really good support for mobile. So there's this really cool mobile navigation library by, I think it's Andy Jocelyn, and it's really cool. Here, this is what it looks like. So it has this sort of iOS-like look to it. It has kind of the back and forth. And if we inspect this, you'll see, presumably here, yeah. So he has his own like custom tag called mobile view. All you really have to do to use this is include his script and then use that tag right there, and then you get a lot of this stuff pretty much for free. So the great thing about these Angular components is it's not like jQuery or something where you typically have to dig through like this huge pile of options. It's pretty intuitive how to use these things. You just throw the tag in there. Easy peasy. There's this really cool like Firefox OS AngularJS boilerplate that some of you may have seen by Komoyo. And this is all built with Angular, but I guess it's more of a Firefox OS look. Oh, this might be too wide. My screen might be too wide for this to actually work. All right, but it looks great on Firefox OS. It looks good on Android and stuff too. Firefox OS is all just HTML, CSS, JavaScript, so this would work fine for other platforms besides just Firefox OS. And if you use jQuery Mobile, this guy, Optiz Consulting or something like that, he has an Angular wrapper around it. So instead of having to do like gross jQuery stuff, you can just use these sort of directives in this style of doing things. So that's just a small look into some of what third-party developers outside of even like the Angular core team have built on top of Angular. Okay, so now on to PhoneGap. So WTF is a PhoneGap. So let's say you're building your app and you realize, like, wait a minute, the web browser can't actually access this API on the phone. So PhoneGap essentially, it bridges that gap, as the name sort of implies, and lets you access kind of native phone features inside of a browser. So it also lets you bundle your app or your web app rather as a native app. And then there's also a cool set of like build and deploy tools for I want to build an Android app and an iOS app and some things like that. So the tooling around that is pretty handy. So the next question is, you may have heard of Cordova, so what's the difference here? From their website, PhoneGap is a distribution of Apache Cordova. Like, okay, I don't really know what that means, but you can Google it and see the difference. I'm going to use the term PhoneGap. I guess it's the Adobe branded version of kind of the open source project, and I think it also includes some of their special build tools and services that they have around it. But the open source project behind it is basically Cordova. Okay, so why PhoneGap? We talked about this a little bit. You know all of these things, and you're way too lazy or busy, probably too busy. You guys look like the busy bunch. So to learn all of these different platforms, you know, like you have to learn different languages, you have to learn different APIs. Even if you know Java, you know that you can't just dive into Android. You have to know all of these APIs and these different patterns and ways of doing things, and when can you run things on certain processes. And you just want to write the code and have it be available everywhere. And again, maybe you want to use the camera or the accelerometer, or you want to have some sort of like push notifications, or something else that you know your phone can do, but your web browser can't. And that's a sad state, but PhoneGap makes that a little bit better. So in order to use these sort of features in PhoneGap, the APIs are all in JavaScript. So PhoneGap exposes kind of this web view that has these extra features that they add on here. And like this is pretty idiomatic JavaScript here. So you get an onSuccess callback that gets acceleration information, for instance, if you use the acceleration API. And it's all JavaScript objects. It's not any weird stuff like, I don't know. It's not weird. It's very natural for a JavaScript developer to use something like this. Okay, so in order to kind of demo and prove to myself that something like this is possible and reasonable, I made this app called Hitch a Ride. I actually did it as part of my one of a course at my university. And the idea was it would be a real-time carpooling, car-sharing app. So you have a car and you're going to drive somewhere. You put in where you're from, where you're leaving from, where you're going to, and someone else says, I need a ride from here to here, and it kind of intelligently maps people and matches them up and gives them notifications in real time. So if you're interested in all of that, it's all on GitHub, so you can check it out. There's like instructions on how to get it going, and I don't want to go into that too much because it looks like I only have about 15 minutes left. So I'll demo it, I guess, real quick. It looks basically like this. It uses Google Plus to sign in because I didn't want to write an auth system. So let's open this up. I have to sign in. It's blocking my pop-ups. Why is it blocking that? Okay, so I'm going to use my university email because I'm using my Gmail here. Oh, okay, it doesn't want me to sign up with that one. All All right, it wants me to sign in through here. Sorry. All right, there we go. So there's University me on the left and Gmail me on the right. Let's say, so Gmail me is driving from Chicago to LA, and other me wants to go from Joplin, where is that, Missouri, to Oklahoma City. This doesn't mean anything to you guys because you're all European and that's the middle of nowhere. So let's say I want to depart soon, and I hit submit. These guys each get notifications, and you can go here, and it shows you my beautiful picture. Then it gives you directions, and you can also just open this up in Google Maps. So this is easier to demo here, but this also actually, and you can give feedback, and it's a whole like full-featured, pretty cool app. So you can go through the code yourself and look at it. It's not the most beautiful thing ever, but it's a good proof of concept, I think. And if you're interested in developing apps this way, there's a few things that I learned in there that I'm going to go over now. Okay, so the APIs that I use for push notifications, if you're using this as a web app or in the web browser on the phone, it uses WebSockets. Otherwise, on Android, it uses Google Cloud Messaging. It uses geolocation, which is actually available in a lot of modern browsers, surprisingly. So that I didn't actually have to go to PhoneGap for. But if I wanted to port this app to a phone platform that didn't expose that in the browser, I would be able to through PhoneGap. And then it uses something called in-app browser for authentication. So you saw how I signed in through Google+. So in order to get that to work, I needed a plugin that opened up Google+ in the right way inside of the web view for PhoneGap. So this was actually, I think, a plugin. I don't think it's in the main PhoneGap repo, but we'll see. So on the client, there were a bunch of other libraries that we used. So I used Yeoman to scaffold it, partially because I work on Yeoman, and I don't really need an excuse to play around with these sort of technologies. I'm working on them day in, day out. So I used Bootstrap to do all the theming, and there's Boot Swatch, which is a pretty cool site that gives you different themes if you're not a designer like me. And then you saw the Google Plus sign-in. So on the server, I'm using Node with Express just to serve basically the basic site, and there's also kind of an information like how to download the app site. And then Socket.io to handle some of the web browser or WebSocket stuff. Okay, so now time for some pro tips that I learned when I was working on this. So because Angular, the Angular view is just HTML and it consumes that scope, you can write different HTML pages that use exactly the same JavaScript, right? All you have to do is have the curlies and the ng app and ng controller line up in the right place. So one thing that you might consider doing is serve one for desktop and one for mobile. The reason for that is, we like to do things like responsive design, but for mobile you might want to have, really, really compressed and a really aggressive strategy for reducing the amount of network traffic, whereas on the desktop site you might not care as much. So it's one possibility. Not necessarily the best for everything, and that's not what I ended up doing for this app because it was I was a little crunched for time, but it's something to consider. So again, for the desktop site, you might want to manage resources in a different way, and for the mobile site, maybe you want to inline everything. So you could build some of these things into a build process as well, and actually Yeoman has support to do some of these inlining things and that sort of thing. So AngularJS uses dependency injection. How many are familiar with dependency injection? Good, very good. All right, so you know the basic idea, right? It's don't call me, I'll call you. Each module of your code and each thing a controller, it doesn't kind of go out and instantiate things itself. It asks from a provider to get this thing, and then each module registers itself in the provider. This isn't like your grandpa's DI. It's not like some XML configuration thing. It's you load in which JavaScript files you want. They register themselves, and then the DI system in Angular takes care of the rest. So why is this useful? So it's really cool. One of the things that I was able to do with this app that I wrote is I was able to optimize and replace implementations for Angular internals, actually. So you saw I used ng-click, right? So that binds to a click event. But on mobile, you want to be able to bind to a click and also the right touch handler, so that way you don't get that weird delay. So I was able to actually modify the behavior of ng-click so that way it listened to both events and behaved correctly. You can also decorate existing modules. This was actually the same idea as what I previously described with this click. I wasn't rewriting the whole implementation from scratch. I was augmenting it with a little bit of extra code. So you can do all sorts of neat hacks there. One thing that's cool is you can really easily profile an Angular app by decorating some existing service that you care about. Starting a timer, run the existing implementation, stop the timer, log it somewhere, go on with it. So it's cool in that you don't have to be in there modifying the Angular.js source to put these things in there. You can really easily do this yourself. And the final thing is it's really good for mocking out things for testing. This is actually probably the main reason that Angular has DI, is that testing is a really, really, really important aspect of Angular. And there's a lot of great tutorials using Karma, which is a test runner that one of the guys, Vojta, who works on Angular at Google, wrote. And what that does is it lets you simultaneously test in multiple browsers on your own computer and get all of the results aggregated in a command line, single report, basically. So that's really cool. So general pro tips is watch your CSS, right? If you use something like Bootstrap, like I did, you're going to get a lot of crap if you just use the generic Bootstrap CSS file, right? There's a ton of, widgets and things like that you're not going to be using, and you also want minimal fancy stuff. So things like CSS gradients, transparencies, things like this, those are really going to bog down a mobile device. So if you can grab those out, they're usually not worth the hassle. If you use things like images instead, and images that don't have some opacity to them, that saves you a lot of trouble on mobile, and especially in PhoneGap, where a lot of times it has to use a web view that's not quite as fast as the other browser because restrictions around various APIs and stuff. So you also want to watch your HTML. I mean, as you saw, Angular didn't require us to do anything crazy with the DOM. It's pretty sparse in there. So it's really up to you to not over-engineer, over-design your HTML. You don't want to put a ton of stuff in there. And I ended up using Bootstrap, which is kind of an offender of this. You have to have this container, and then a that container, and then a this container. And trying to avoid that as best you can is pretty good, because that can start to be intense on the device's memory. The other thing is to size images correctly. I guess that's technically not under the moniker of HTML, but if you load an image that's this size and resize it to this, you get extra reflows. So these are general tips that work everywhere, but these are really the things. The things I mentioned in this slide, and then these were really the places that hit the performance. Not Angular. Angular is actually pretty good about keeping DOM manipulation in check. So debugging. Debugging isn't really a great story right now. There are a couple tools recently, actually. I think. Does this go to? Yeah. Okay. So Paul Irish recently posted on Google Plus this awesome extensive list of ways to debug Chrome on Android, and also the Chrome web view and how to do all these things. So the story might be a little bit better than when I did this a couple months ago. But start with your browser and build your website for the desktop first, I think. Or, build it in the browser first. Then, once you get all of those bugs ironed out and you know how the thing should be working, after that, then it's useful to start using PhoneGap, wrap it, and then use these sort of tools to debug the remaining things. I mean, it's just a little bit overkill if you have to debug, the regular app and then PhoneGap weird things that you're unfamiliar with because you just started using PhoneGap and stuff like that. So again, I think that this made sense for me. Your mileage may vary. Definitely check out the tools around this, because if you understand the tools, that'll make your life a lot easier. So targeting different platforms, PhoneGap has, I think, better tools for this now, so this might be a little bit outdated. So I kind of symlinked my different resources into folders, and that was an okay approach. But I think now they have better build scripts. So tweak your build scripts as you need to. Otherwise, it's not too bad. The main things that the main areas that I was concerned about this is for serving the desktop site versus the mobile. There was that ng-click kind of hack thing that I did, and so I only wanted to load that code on the mobile browser that's inside of PhoneGap. And similarly, I had kind of WebSockets versus using Google's cloud messaging, and so the code for that is a little bit different because I'm either calling into PhoneGap or I'm using WebSockets, which are in there. So I had kind of an API that was consistently revealed to Angular, but the module around it, I needed to have two different implementations. Okay, so this is the obligatory no silver bullet slide. Angular's not a silver bullet. PhoneGap's not a silver bullet. If you look at kind of native web app versus hybrid web app, obviously you don't really get the native look and feel if you're doing something hybrid. I don't think it's even really worth trying for it. If you want native look and feel, write it native. It's a lot of hassle otherwise. Performance is definitely a little bit worse for a hybrid app, but phones are getting more powerful, and if you are careful and do a good job testing and do a good job with best practices, you can mitigate most of the issue there, I think. Debugging is not as easy as just opening up your Chrome DevTools and going to town, right? It's a little bit more involved than that if you're using a web view. And similarly, testing is a little bit difficult. I was able to eventually test a web view, but it was much more difficult than, for instance, Karma, the test runner that we use with Angular. All you have to do is point a browser to a URL, and it runs the test. So, even on a phone, all you have to do is have your phone on your local network, type it into your browser, hit enter, and that's all you have to do, and it works on anything. So, do what makes sense for your app. Learn the tools. Go out there and figure out what works for you. I can't possibly say that these tools are the definitive end-all thing. I can't possibly imagine every possible app that someone would want to write or use. And so what's next? I think PhoneGap is more of a transitional tool. I don't think that it'll be around forever. It would be really nice if browsers had the same APIs that PhoneGap had, and we just could cut out the PhoneGap step altogether. And I think Firefox OS is a really good start on this. So I don't know. It's not certain to me that Firefox OS will be the next big thing. But the ideas in there, I think, are really good. And similarly, the ideas in PhoneGap are really good. So, submit lots of tickets on Chrome's mobile bug tracker and be like, hey, you guys should add this. And, star it up and pile on that. Hopefully, we can get that in other platforms and other browsers as well. Okay, so if you guys have any questions, you can ask me online or you can ask me now. And thanks again for coming.